Welcome back, everyone, to part 2 of the Great Northern War as we react to this fantastic series by Extra History. Glad you guys seem to be enjoying it so far. Our episode 1 yesterday was one of the best performing videos we've had in quite a while, so that tells me you want to see more. So we're going to dive into part 2 today. As with any of these series that I do, I like to address things from the day before based on the comments that I got from people. A couple of things I want to address real quick. I had a number of comments of people saying that the Tsardom of Russia and the Empire of Russia were the same thing. Well, no, that's not technically true. It seems like people are basing this on the fact that the word Tsar in Russian basically is the same word they use for emperor. That's because of what came later. In 1721, at the end of this, as I'm sure we'll get into, at the end of the Great Northern War, the Russian Senate declared the Russian Empire and made Peter the Great the emperor of all Russias. Prior to that, historically, it's known as the Tsardom of Russia. So there's a clear delineation. From the time of Ivan the Terrible up until 1721, it's known as the Tsardom of Russia. 1721 on to the end of Nicholas II's reign, it's known as the Empire of Russia or the Russian Empire. So there is a clear delineation between the two, even if the name is just semantics. So that's the first thing. The second thing, a number of people pointed out to me correctly that in reading the article toward the end of the first episode, I read the wrong name as far as where it is that Charles XII ends up dying. So I'm sure we'll get into that when we get to the final episodes of this, but thank you for correcting that. And as always, if there are corrections to be made from any episode of anything I do, I usually pin those comments in the videos. So let's go ahead and dive into part 2.
With the Russians and the Danes effectively out of the war, Charles planned to descend with the full force of his victorious army upon the one enemy that remained to him, Augustus, King of Poland-Lithuania. Now, you would think that the situation would be looking pretty grim for Poland-Lithuania. They've just finished getting kicked around, they're basically out of money and resources, they're politically fractured, and their allies have essentially all dropped out of the war. Most people would back out now, find a diplomatic solution, see if they could cut their losses. But Augustus had a new plan. Just keep losing. He made a few...
His plan was to just keep losing. Now, here's the thing. I believe that he was also, I think he also ruled over Saxony. And I believe it was actually in his role as the Lord of Saxony that he actually fights this war. I believe that, and I don't really know the details of how the Poland-Lithuanian Commonwealth, the politics and their government worked, but I don't believe they actually were technically at war. So I think he was using Saxony as his way of fighting. So Poland-Lithuania was actually looking for a way out. They just didn't get it.
Half-hearted attempts at peace, figuring that if he didn't really put a lot of effort into it, he could get right on to losing some more. So when Charles XII basically ignored his call for peace, Augustus gathered his generals and said to them, "Guys, we really absolutely cannot let the Swedes cross the Dwina River, or hoo boy, are we gonna lose a lot. Wink wink, nudge nudge." And with that, his commanders set out to meet what supporting troops the Russians could give them, which surprisingly was actually more men than they were fielding themselves. Proceeding with the plan, the main Polish-Lithuanian commander managed to deceive himself into thinking that the Swedes were going to land miles from where they were, and went personally with the best of his troops to defend a place where really nobody was going.
This is just a comedy of errors. And so a lot of people, when we talk about Charles XII, and people talk about him as being a great military leader, and I believe he was a very good military leader. He's not Napoleon, but he's a very good military leader. But how much of this was really about Charles XII doing stuff right versus his enemies just making a complete debacle of everything they tried to do to oppose him? It's the same argument you could make in other times in history. For example, the American Civil War. How much was Robert E. Lee a great tactician versus the fact that he just faced really poor opponents in the leadership of the Union armies that he faced?
All while leaving two non-military men basically in charge of the real army. Unaware of this, and so undaunted by Augustus's fearsome plan, Charles XII landed where everybody knew he was going to land all along, except for this master of self-deception. Yet still, despite all of this, the odds for the Polish-Lithuanian forces seemed pretty good. They outnumbered Charles 3-1, and they were dug in, while Charles would have to manage an amphibious landing and assault their entrenched positions. As dawn just barely broke through the darkness, the Swedes filled boats with damp straw and set them alight, sending them sailing towards the shore, great plumes of smoke obscuring their approach. The Polish-Lithuanian cannonades fired, and the clever floating counter-batteries of the Swedes sang. Under this bombardment, the troops approached, and in the first vessel, against all entireties, sat the Swedish king.
That's hardcore right there. The kings in the first wave, I mean, this is like, you're talking Normandy, okay? You're talking about Eisenhower landing with the first wave at Normandy. That's the kind of stuff that's going on here. That's hardcore. I like that a lot.
Charles XII. He landed with his grenadiers. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell upon him, planning to push him back into the waves, but they faced the best of the Swedish regiments, led personally by their king.
And you gotta... I said this yesterday, and I'll say it again. When your king, your young king, who's probably the age of a lot of these men who are fighting, maybe even younger, is willing to go in with the first wave, that's going to inspire you, man, and you're going to fight. If he's willing to be here by my side, yeah, I'll fight for a guy like that.
The Swedes did not falter. The Polish-Lithuanian troops fell back, and the Russians fled in a screaming panic.
3-1, and they
never
ran.
Fired a shot. At last, though, the Polish-Lithuanian commander returned with all the troops he had taken with him, and the Polish-Lithuanian forces assailed the Swedes again. But Swedish reinforcements had now landed, and they were now much greater in number. Again, the Poles and the Lithuanians were beaten back, and then a third time. At which point, the Polish-Lithuanians were basically like, you know what? Screw this, let's go home. Which was a pretty good thing for Charles, because having come from ravaged Livonia, he basically started this whole campaign with no supplies whatsoever. He did manage to capture plenty after the battle, though, and was now well on his way to being ready for a good long fight.
So yeah, there is an element of good luck for him because he's facing some stupidity on the opponent's part. But there's also, boy, the guy's just got guts. I'll say guts. Landing with the first wave, an amphibious landing in an attack, outnumbered 3-1 with no supplies. That's gutsy stuff, man.
Augustus, realizing now that the Swedes were clearly not caving before his plan to just keep losing, went back to the drawing board. Now he had an even better plan. Now he would just keep losing.
Lose harder.
And so, while Charles wintered in Wergen, throwing snowballs at his officers and breaking their windows so that they didn't fall too much in love with comfort, Augustus prepared for his next near miss. This time, he was to get himself trounced in a swamp. It was a near-run thing for a while. For a moment, it looked like the Polish-Lithuanian forces might accidentally prevail. Augustus was in a...
Might accidentally prevail. I love... you don't see this side of extra history too much. This seems more like a overly sarcastic productions kind of thing, where they're kind of constantly talking about how they're trying to lose. And yeah, it's cool. I like the change of pace.
Good position, surrounded by woods and boggy terrain. He outnumbered the Swedish forces 2-1.
Outnumbered again.
There was just no way the Swedes were going to drag their cannon through that morass. It was touch and go for a bit, hard fighting for the Swedish forces, who were, as usual, exhausted from Charles's relentless marches. So then Augustus, nice fellow that he was, managed to let the Swedes take over his camp and turn his own artillery on his troops while they tried to retreat through a marsh. Yet still, Charles was not cowed by Augustus's mighty strategy of just keep losing forever. And so Augustus refined his plans even further. He realized now that this approach had been too complex thus far, too multifaceted. He would now simplify it, put it in layman's terms. His new plan was losing. Keep doing it. So Charles rode up...
Just do it! Lose harder! Oh my gosh.
...up to the gates of Krakow and shouted, "Open the door!" And when the guards peeked out to see who this shouting man was, Charles personally forced the gate and held it, while 300 of his men, who, not quite prepared for this, charged through anyway.
The king... I didn't know this, okay? Charles XII is fast becoming one of my all-time favorite human beings in history. He went to the door himself, shouted, "Open the door," and then held it open while his men ran inside. The king did that. Oh my gosh, I love this guy.
And so it was that Charles took the great Polish city of Krakow with a handful of men armed only with unloaded muskets and canes. You've got to hand it to Augustus. That was some solid losing. But even this did not make Charles quit in disgust. And so, after being deposed by Charles XII, who elevated another king in his place, Augustus spent some time thinking. Pondering for a while and furrowing his brow, he at last came to one resplendent, crystal-clear idea. He had thought the one sentence that he needed to think, and that sentence was, "Cool. Now seems like a good time for a civil war." So Augustus raised his banner against the new king. But the civil war began slowly.
So the man who lost and lost and lost some more is now going to try and overthrow the guy that replaced him? Wow.
Augustus assembled his forces in the Duchy of Saxony, while the Russians ravaged Sweden's Baltic provinces, which really had little to do with Poland-Lithuania, but, good times. Meanwhile, Charles laid siege to the ancient fortress of Thorn, where he won surprising praise from the Polish people, as when the city fell, he treated it with remarkable gentleness, letting captured men return to their families, even driving a herd of cattle and a flock of sheep into the city so that the starving defenders could eat.
Here, instead of laying siege and starving people out, you're like, here, take some food. I mean, all of this is just crazy.
But once things got going, the whole war teetered back and forth, with Augustus recapturing Warsaw while Charles was out trying to compel parts of Poland-Lithuania to support his puppet king, and then Charles swooping back in to retake the capital while Augustus beat a retreat. But by 1705, the dominoes began to fall. The great Poland-Lithuanian plan was to crush the Swedes between the hammer of Augustus's forces marching from the west and the great Russian anvil to the east. But Augustus's forces ran into a tiny Swedish contingent outside of Warsaw, 1,900 cavalry and just 60 infantry. The Polish-Lithuanian commander, with his 10,000 men, was certain of victory.
5-1 odds. Okay, 1,900 cavalry, 60 infantry against 10,000. Again, these crazy long odds.
His forces rushed against this small band of Swedes, but somehow, by sheer grit, the Swedish cavalry, despite being outflanked or almost encircled by the overwhelming number of the enemy, threw back their attackers. And then, at the last minute, the 60 infantrymen emerged from the tall rye grass where they'd been hiding, the surprise turning the Polish-Lithuanian effort to regroup into a rout. Predictably, something similar happened to the Russians in the east, and soon the iron was beating up both the hammer and the anvil. And for the sake of brevity, this just keeps happening all over, both in open battle and in sieges.
Now, I will say this, and I don't really know the nature of the makeup of the armies of the Russians and the Poland-Lithuanians at this time, but I do know that for the Swedish army, Charles XII had a pretty substantial standing army. Something like 80 to 90,000 men. Standing armies of that size were not a common thing at this point. This is when they're starting to become a thing. But up until that point, you were basically raising conscripts, you were raising levies. These were people that weren't professional soldiers. And so you can expect that a professional standing army is going to be able to take on a force larger than them. It's similar to what the Romans did back in the day when you would have Caesar taking on 2 and 3 to 1 at times. That professional, well-trained force using good tactics and good discipline that's well led can take on a much larger force. So this isn't completely just on the ineptitude of the enemy. This is also tells you a little bit of something about the Swedish forces.
The Polish-Lithuanian forces and the Russian forces just keep getting crushed. But Augustus made one more push for Warsaw. Here again he was intercepted by a force half his size, but this time superior in cavalry. His commander tried to hide which of his troops were Russian by having them turn their uniforms inside out, but even this clever ruse did no good. The Swedish commander realized which part of the line was made up of Russian conscripts and assaulted it with all of his force, swinging his cavalry in from the rear and the side. Meanwhile, the rest of the army was rendered useless by assaults on both flanks, the Swedish commander copying a page from Hannibal's book and managing to envelop the enemy forces with his smaller army, much as Hannibal did at Cannae. Soon, the army was in full retreat. But with their superior cavalry, the Swedes were able to cut them off, and the retreat became an unconditional surrender. No longer able to field an army, Augustus was forced to sign a humiliating peace, giving up his kingship, abandoning his alliance with Russia, and acknowledging Charles's puppet king of Poland-Lithuania. But Augustus is not done yet. Eventually, he would stumble upon a novel, new, and arguably better idea: winning. So join us next time as the two greatest figures of this period, Charles XII and Peter the Great, square off in a battle for the destiny of Eastern Europe.
And in the end, much like what Napoleon faced, nobody could beat Napoleon one-on-one. It took an alliance of nations to bring down Napoleon. Same thing's going to happen with Charles XII. Eventually, it's going to be not just Russia and their might, but also an alliance of other nations that's going to help out in the end. But if anybody's got any suggestions for a really good biography of Charles XII, I'm interested, and I want to check out more about this guy because, boy, cool dude, man. I mean, I'm impressed. I am really impressed. So I want to learn more about him, and I'm going to start that right away, I think. But let me know your thoughts. Use the comment section below. The original video, there's a link in the description. Thank you and welcome to all of our new patrons who have signed up. We are close to 300, which is amazing, and I'm so grateful to every one of you. We'll see you again tomorrow with the next episode.